In this video, I'm going to show you how to knit in the round. When you knit in the round, you do a cast on just like you do for a flat piece. So I've already prepared my needle with my cast on. I used the crochet cast on because the pattern I'm making for this demonstration is the Waverly Weekend Cowl, and it calls for the crochet cast on. But you can use any cast on you like. Cast on like you normally would for a flat piece, but do leave yourself a slightly longer tail than you normally would at the beginning, because you can use that to close the inevitable tiny little gap there will be between the first and last cast on stitch at the end of when you're finished. You can use that to sew up that little gap. So I've cast it on. It's very important that you make sure that your cast on is not twisted. In fact, you'll see it in many patterns that says join without twisting. So what that means is you've got this row of stitches here all around your cable. And sometimes as you're casting on, those stitches can get twisted around like this. Twisted around kind of like that. And that would be disastrous for your work, because if you start knitting, you might not notice that twist until you're several inches into your work, and the only way to fix it is to rip it out. So this is very important to get your join without twisting. So we're going to go around and make sure all of the cast on stitches are facing toward the middle and they're not twisted around the cable or cord or the needle anywhere. So I am just going around and putting them all. So there is a twist right there. So I'm going to fix that and get them all laying so that they're in the center of the little circle I have going on here. Now, this piece doesn't have a ton of stitches in it. I think I cast it on 108 stitches. But if you really get a lot of stitches on your needle, they can be all really kind of wrinkled up like this, and it can be really hard to tell. So take your time. Hopefully you have someplace flat you can lay it on like I'm doing here, and make sure that you've got all of your stitches in the middle and none of them are twisted. And there are photos in the full tutorial for this that you can look at to further see what I'm talking about. And they are available. If you're not looking at this video in the tutorial, there is a link below it. So I've got all of my stitches facing the same direction. They're not twisted around my cord or cable. And I'm going to pick up my work and knit like I normally do. Now, I normally knit Continental style, so I hold the yarn in my left hand, but I'm going to show this English style as well. So to begin knitting in the round, you want the working yarn attached to the needle that you're holding in your right hand, like it is coming off this needle right here. So the tail is on the needle in my left hand here. And then we're going to simply, with the needle, knit like we normally do. Knit one stitch, slide it off your left needle just like you normally do. That has joined the piece to continue in the round. Now before I go on, I'm going to take that out and show you how to do it if you're an English style knitter. So it is just doing a knit stitch. Put your working yarns on the right needle, and you're going into the stitch on the left needle just like you normally would to knit, and you just knit that stitch. All right, I'm going to take it out and show you one more time. English style. And I'll take it out and show you one more time, Continental style. And this is something I often forget when I'm working on my own projects until I've already started. So I oftentimes do this after the join when I get around to the first time, but you really want to place a stitch marker before you join it to mark the beginning of your round. Now, I like to use a row counter as my stitch marker for knitting in the round. It has, I've used a darning needle to put a piece of yarn through my stitch marker and tied it into a little loop so that I can just hang it off my needle and use it as my beginning of round stitch marker. Now, I like to do that because it reminds me every time I get around to that row counter to move the tally on the row counter, so I always know which round I am on. Okay, so joining Continental style, once again, the working yarn is coming off of the needle in my right hand, and I'm just going to knit a stitch like normal. You do want to pull that stitch up snug. If you leave it too loose, you're going to end up with ladders in your work, which means you're just going to have long strands of yarn between actually it'll be back here between the first stitch and the last stitch of the round. You may have seen it in some other people's works or heard people talk about ladders in their work. That's why, it's because they didn't pull that first stitch snugly enough. Now mine looks real loose. It's because my tail is coming loose. There we go. Now, to knit in the round, you're just going to continue knitting around just like you would for a flat piece. You're just going to keep going and going and going. And as I knit around this first round, I want to tell you some things about knitting in the round. Now, I'm knitting Continental style here, but it's just the regular knit stitch. You would follow whatever stitches are in your pattern and knit with whichever style of knitting you prefer to use. It's easier for me to work through these talking points when I'm knitting Continental style because I don't have to think about it as much since this is the way I normally knit. So I just want to mention some things. Whenever you are knitting in the round, you're always making a tube. It might be a big tube that's going to be the bodice of a sweater, or it might be a tiny little tube that's going to be a finger on a glove, or, you know, a fingerless mitt or a hat. Basically, you're forming a tube. And it's important, I think, because it helps to visualize some of the things I'm going to tell you next. It is possible to twist your work on any round in the first inch or so of your piece. I talked about the importance of not twisting your work when you make that join, and I laid my piece out and showed you the cast on all nice and not twisted around the cord or the cable. That is not the only time you have to worry about that. It is important that you check your work very carefully for the first inch or two at least. And I'm sorry that if that noise is getting in the video, my row counter is dragging on my table, making that brushing noise, and I apologize for that. So if you don't put your work down, if you just keep going, it's not as likely to get twisted as it is if you take a break, you put your work down, you come back to it. It is real easily twisted then in the first inch or so of your project. So just be aware of that and be careful. Always check very diligently to make sure that your work is not twisted around the cord or the needle anywhere. The only way to fix a twist is to rip it out and start over. So it's kind of depressing when you do find it, especially if you're a few inches into your piece. And trust me, it happens even to more experienced knitters. So don't beat yourself up if that happens to you. Another common mistake with knitting in the round is that it's easy to pick your work up after you've taken a break from it and knit in the wrong direction. So instead of going this way, people often pick it up, turn it around, and start working this way. You never turn your work when you're knitting in the round like you do when you're knitting flat. Well, I shouldn't say never. I mean, there are times like when you're doing short rows that you occasionally turn your work, but if you are just knitting in the round, you typically don't turn your work. So if you do pick it up and you start knitting backwards, that means you've turned it and you're knitting on the wrong side. And again, the only way to fix that is to rip it out back to where you turned it and redo that work. So I want to tell you a couple of tips to help you not make that mistake. Whenever you pick up your work, now it's not real evident, you know, since I've only got one row done here, but whenever you pick up your work, you always want to have your right side of your tube on the outside of your work. So you want the right side of your work to be facing you, you don't want it to be upside down like this where you're looking at the wrong side. You want it to be down like this and you're looking at the right side here. You also, this is very important, always have the working yarn coming off the needle that's in your right hand. So you can see here my working yarn is coming out of this stitch right here. If I loosen that up, you can see when I pull the working yarn, it is coming off of the stitch on my right needle. I always say if your working yarn is not on the right, then it's wrong. If it's not right, then it's wrong. You always want it to be coming off of the stitch on the needle in your right hand. Those two tips will help to ensure that you don't pick up your work and start working on it backwards. Now here I am almost up to my beginning of the round, and I know that it's my beginning of the round because I put my stitch marker or my row counter in there. And what is going on here? There we go. I don't know how in the world I did that, but I got that stitch on backwards, so I just knit that through the back loop. Now, you've got your stitch marker or your row counter. You just slide that from the left needle over to the right needle. Remember to change it to your next row, so I'm going to change it to 2. Whoops. And I like to change my row counter right before I start the row that it shows. So I'm getting ready to start row 2. That way, if I put my work down, no matter when I put my work down, it's always telling me which row to pick up with and to continue working on. And I just realized I should be purling this row, so I just backed out those 2 stitches. Okay. Now remember the first stitch of the row, you want to pull it up snug so you don't get ladders in your work. And you just continue knitting around. Binding off for knitting in the round is the same as binding off for a flat piece. There is one little trick that I will be making a video here shortly to show you on how to use the tail when you bind off to a special way to sew it in to close the little gap that happens between your first and your last bind off stitch when you bind it off in the round, so that your bind off appears to be seamless. And you do have to push your stitches around your cord sometimes. If you have the only needles you have for your project are longer than your cast on. So say for example you're making fingerless mitts. The cast on's pretty short, so most people don't have needles short enough to just purely knit in the round like I'm showing you in this video to do a small circumference like that. Or certainly say you're doing fingers on a glove. You can imagine that's a really tiny circumference. You don't have cords short enough to do that. You could use double pointed needles, or my preferred method is to use the magic loop method of knitting in the round. You can use circular needles for it, and I do have a separate video that will be linked in the comments or in the description below this video for the magic loop method of knitting in the round. So I hope you will check out the other videos, and I hope this video demystified the process of knitting in the round for you.